This video is a counterfactual historical theory created for educational and analytical purposes only. It does not promote, justify, or glorify Nazi ideology. All conclusions are based on historical research and documented sources. In the summer of 1942, as German armies pushed deep into Soviet territory and maps in Berlin were redrawn almost weekly, a strange contradiction began to surface inside the Third Reich. Publicly, Nazi leaders spoke of destiny, inevitability, and a 1,000-year future. Privately, in memoranda never meant for speeches or posters, German planners asked a darker question. What happens if we actually win? This was not a moral question. It was logistical, administrative, economic. And it revealed something unsettling. The men who designed Nazi victory understood that it would not bring stability, peace, or even long-term German prosperity. It would unleash a system that could only survive through permanent violence. The idea of a victorious Nazi Europe has often been reduced to fantasy. Swastikas over London, German flags in Moscow, a continent frozen in totalitarian silence. But the reality envisioned by Nazi institutions was far more radical, far more destructive, and far less stable than popular imagination suggests. Unlike speculative fiction, historians do not need to guess what a Nazi victory would have looked like. The plans already existed. They were written by economists, demographers, SS officers, and legal scholars. They were stamped, revised, debated, and partially implemented wherever German troops advanced. And when examined closely, these documents reveal a future that was not only catastrophic for occupied peoples, but fundamentally unsustainable, even for Germany itself. At the center of this vision stood the SS, not as a police force, not as an elite guard, but as the ruling caste of a new continental empire. One of the most chilling documents to survive the war is Generalplan Ost, a long-term blueprint for Eastern Europe developed by SS planners between 1941 and 1942. It outlined with bureaucratic precision the removal of tens of millions of people through starvation, forced deportation, and mass killing. Slavic populations were to be reduced to a permanent labor reservoir. Entire regions were to be emptied, renamed, and resettled by ethnic Germans. This was not retaliation. It was not wartime excess. It was policy. According to demographic projections cited in post-war analyses, up to 50 to 60 million people were marked for elimination or displacement in Eastern Europe alone. Ukraine was to become an agricultural colony, Poland a transit zone, Russia a fractured landscape of depopulated territories governed by SS administrators. Victory did not mean peace. It meant administration, and administration required constant coercion. Even within the Nazi leadership, doubts emerged. Internal economic reports warned that the Reich's industrial system was dangerously dependent on conquest. Germany lacked sufficient oil, food security, and raw materials to sustain a peaceful empire. War was not a phase. It was the engine. Historian Richard J. Evans, in his comprehensive study The Third Reich at War, notes that by 1942, Germany was already consuming resources faster than it could replace them. Forced labor temporarily masked the crisis, but planners understood that the system required endless expansion to avoid collapse. A victorious Reich would therefore face an impossible choice: demobilize and implode economically, or continue wars of expansion indefinitely. There was no third option. The Nazi vision of Europe was not one of stable borders, but of perpetual motion, conquest feeding production, production feeding conquest. In such a system, rebellion was not a threat. It was an expectation. This reality shaped Allied intelligence assessments during the war. British and American analysts were less concerned with a peaceful Nazi-dominated Europe than with what would inevitably follow it: renewed global conflict. As early as 1943, strategic planners in Washington began modeling scenarios in which Germany defeated the Soviet Union. The conclusions were remarkably consistent. A Nazi-controlled continent would rapidly come into conflict with the United States, either through economic warfare, colonial competition, or direct military confrontation. Some scenarios predicted a German-led nuclear program reaching operational capacity within a decade. Victory, in other words, postponed catastrophe. It did not prevent it. The Holocaust itself provides the clearest evidence that Nazi ideology could not stabilize, even after achieving its primary goals. The destruction of European Jewry was not instrumental to winning the war. It consumed resources, diverted rail capacity, and destabilized occupied territories. Yet it accelerated as German fortunes declined, proof that ideology overrode rational statecraft. In Eastern Europe, the effects of occupation foreshadowed the future. Regions stripped of food supplies collapsed into famine. Labor quotas drained villages of working-age populations. Resistance movements multiplied, not diminished, as German control tightened. The Nazi state did not pacify, it radicalized. A detailed examination of occupied Ukraine, presented in the Nazi Empire Building and the Holocaust in Ukraine, demonstrates that German authorities repeatedly underestimated the administrative burden of mass repression. Security forces were stretched thin. Local collaboration proved unreliable. Brutality bred instability faster than it imposed order. The more the Reich conquered, the more ungovernable it became. This paradox lay at the heart of Nazi victory planning. The regime imagined a continent unified under racial hierarchy, yet lacked any mechanism to maintain it without endless terror. Even German civilians would not have been spared its consequences. Internal SS memoranda discussed population controls, reproductive policies, and ideological screening that extended deep into the Reich itself. Total victory would have meant total surveillance. In this sense, the Third Reich was not building a future state. It was constructing a permanent emergency. The image of Nazi banners flying over Europe hides a deeper truth. The regime was not designed to rule indefinitely. It was designed to mobilize, purge, and expand until exhaustion. And exhaustion was inevitable. This is why the question, "What if the Nazis had won World War II?" is not speculative fiction. It is a historical inquiry grounded in documents, projections, and lived experience. The answer is not a frozen dystopia, but a world in constant convulsion, marked by mass death, economic collapse, and unending war. In the chapters that follow, we will examine how Europe would have been reorganized under Nazi rule, why the Reich's economic model guaranteed instability, how resistance and repression would have fed each other, and why even total military victory could not save the Nazi system from destroying itself. Because the most dangerous myth of all is not that the Nazis could have won, but that their victory would have brought order. A continent rewritten. What the Nazis planned for Europe. By the time German forces reached the outskirts of Stalingrad, the Nazi leadership had already moved beyond the question of victory. What occupied their attention now was administration. Maps were redrawn, borders erased, and entire nations reduced to demographic problems waiting to be solved. The future of Europe in Nazi planning was not a federation, not an alliance, and not even a classic empire. It was to be a racially engineered space, governed by hierarchy rather than law, and violence rather than consent. At the top of this system stood Germany, not as a nation-state among others, but as a biological core, the only population deemed capable of ruling. Everything else existed to serve it. The ideological foundation for this vision had been laid years before the war, but it was only during the conquest of Eastern Europe that theory became policy. Nowhere was this clearer than in the SS program known as Generalplan Ost. This was not a single document, but a series of evolving drafts produced between 1940 and 1942 by planners within the Reich Main Security Office and the SS Race and Settlement Office. Its purpose was simple: to permanently reshape Eastern Europe in Germany's image. The numbers alone were staggering. Poland was to lose up to 85% of its population. Belarus and Ukraine were to be emptied through a combination of starvation, forced labor, deportation beyond the Urals, and mass killing. Russia, west of the Ural Mountains, was to be fragmented into weak administrative zones, incapable of unified resistance. This was not retaliation for war. It was premeditated colonization. German demographers calculated population surpluses and deficits with chilling detachment. Millions were categorized not as enemies, but as obstacles, biological material occupying land designated for German settlers. Entire cities were scheduled for demolition or radical downsizing. Moscow, in some drafts, was to be flooded and erased from the map. At the same time, plans were drawn up for the settlement of ethnic Germans, not just from the Reich, but from across Europe. Volksdeutsche communities from Romania, the Baltics, and even distant regions of the Soviet Union were to be relocated into newly cleared territories. Roads, railways, and fortified settlements were planned to bind these colonies directly to Berlin. This was to be a Europe of corridors and enclaves, German islands in a sea of controlled populations. Western Europe faced a different fate, but no less restrictive. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were not targeted for mass extermination on the same scale as the East, but they were to be permanently subordinated. Industrial assets were to be absorbed into the German war economy. Political institutions dismantled or hollowed out. Cultural life tightly regulated to eliminate degenerate influences. Even allied or collaborating regimes were never meant to be equals. Italy, despite its status as a formal ally, was viewed with contempt by Nazi racial theorists. Southern Europe was considered biologically inferior, suitable for labor and tourism, not leadership. Any illusion of partnership would have vanished the moment Germany secured full control of the continent. Britain, had it been defeated or forced into peace, was expected to retain nominal independence, but only under strict German supervision. Naval disarmament, colonial concessions, and economic dependency would have followed. London would not have been destroyed. It would have been neutralized. The idea of a sovereign Europe coexisting peacefully under German leadership was a fiction. What the Nazis envisioned was a tiered continent, with rights distributed according to race, loyalty, and usefulness. At the apex stood the SS. Under Heinrich Himmler, the SS was not merely a security organization. It was preparing to become the governing elite of a new order: judges, landowners, administrators, and ideological enforcers rolled into one. SS officers were trained not just in combat, but in racial theory, agrarian policy, and population control. Himmler openly described the SS as a new nobility. Victory would have elevated this caste to unprecedented power. Civilian ministries were already being sidelined during the war, replaced by SS-led administrations in occupied territories. In a post-war Europe, this process would have accelerated. Law would give way to decree, citizenship to racial classification. The consequences for everyday life would have been profound. Movement across borders would require racial clearance. Employment would depend on political reliability. Education would be stripped of critical thinking and reshaped into ideological conditioning. Even German citizens would live under permanent scrutiny, their private lives regulated in the name of racial hygiene and loyalty. Resistance was anticipated and planned for. Nazi security doctrine assumed that large portions of the conquered population would remain hostile indefinitely. The response was not reconciliation, but containment. Ghettoization, collective punishment, hostage-taking, and mass reprisals were institutionalized as tools of governance. The East, in particular, was expected to remain a zone of perpetual counterinsurgency. German planners did not imagine pacified provinces. They imagined controlled wastelands, drained of resources and human capital, kept quiet through terror. What they underestimated was scale. The further German forces advanced, the more stretched their administrative and security apparatus became. Partisan movements multiplied, supply lines lengthened, repression consumed manpower at an unsustainable rate. This problem would not have disappeared with victory. It would have intensified. Historians studying German occupation policies consistently note that Nazi rule generated instability faster than it suppressed it. Each act of collective punishment produced new enemies. Each deportation hollowed out the local economy. Each execution fueled resistance. A continent ruled by fear required constant reinforcement. The economic implications of this system were no less dire. German victory plans assumed the extraction of food, oil, coal, and labor from occupied territories on a massive scale. Ukraine was to feed the Reich. The Caucasus was to fuel it. France and the Low Countries were to industrialize for it. But exploitation has limits. By 1942, occupied Europe was already suffering severe shortages. Agricultural output declined as peasants resisted quotas or fled forced labor drafts. Infrastructure deteriorated under overuse and neglect. Skilled workers were deported, leaving factories understaffed and inefficient. Victory would not have reversed these trends. It would have locked them in. The Nazi economy was not designed for equilibrium. It was designed for mobilization. Civilian consumption was suppressed. Investment flowed into armaments. Long-term planning was sacrificed to immediate military needs. A victorious Reich would have inherited a continent exhausted by years of extraction and incapable of recovery under the same system that drained it. This reality troubled some German economists, though few dared voice their concerns openly. Internal reports warned of declining productivity, demographic imbalance, and the dangers of ruling vast territories through coercion alone. Their warnings went largely unheeded. Ideology demanded expansion. Expansion demanded repression. Repression bred resistance, and resistance justified further repression. It was a closed loop, and victory only widened it. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Nazi planning was its treatment of time. There was no clear endpoint, no final state of peace. The new order was not a destination, but a process. Endless purification, endless struggle, endless war against real and imagined enemies. In this sense, the Nazi vision of Europe was not a stable future, but a permanent emergency masquerading as destiny. Had Germany won the war, Europe would not have entered an era of order. It would have entered an era of managed collapse, one in which violence was not an aberration, but the organizing principle of society. And the further this system expanded, the faster it would have consumed itself. In the next chapter, we will turn to the economic core of this vision and examine why the Nazi system, even in total victory, could not sustain itself without constant war. Because conquest was not the solution to its problems. It was the problem. An economy that could not stop. Why Nazi victory required endless war. At first glance, the economic logic of a victorious Nazi Reich appeared simple. Conquer Europe, seize its resources, feed German industry with foreign labor, secure oil, grain, coal, and steel, prosper. This logic was repeated in speeches, propaganda films, and official statements. It reassured the German public and intimidated occupied populations. But beneath the slogans, the actual structure of the Nazi economy told a very different story. It was not an economy built for peace. It was an economy designed for acceleration and collapse. From the moment Adolf Hitler came to power, Germany's economic revival was tied directly to rearmament. Civilian growth, consumer welfare, and long-term stability were secondary. What mattered was speed. Armaments production expanded faster than industrial capacity. State debt ballooned. Imports outpaced exports. The system worked only because war postponed the reckoning. By the late 1930s, even before the outbreak of World War II, Germany was already facing critical shortages. Oil, rubber, copper, and food supplies were insufficient for sustained growth. The response was not reform, but conquest. This mindset was formalized under the Four-Year Plan, which explicitly subordinated economic rationality to military necessity. The goal was not balance, but readiness. Not sustainability, but dominance. War was not a temporary phase. It was the solution to structural weakness. As territories fell under German control, exploitation intensified. Millions of civilians were deported for forced labor. Agricultural output was redirected toward the Reich. Factories in occupied countries were stripped, relocated, or integrated into German supply chains. For a time, this worked. Between 1940 and 1942, German industrial output increased dramatically. Armaments production surged. Shortages were masked by plunder. The illusion of economic strength took hold. But it was an illusion sustained by exhaustion. Forced labor, the backbone of the wartime economy, was inherently inefficient. Workers were underfed, abused, and untrained. Sabotage was common. Productivity lagged behind expectations. Entire industries depended on terror rather than incentives. German planners knew this. One of the most revealing figures in this system was Albert Speer, who took over armaments production in 1942. Often portrayed after the war as a technocrat detached from ideology, Speer's own correspondence reveals acute awareness of the system's fragility. He understood that production gains were achieved not through innovation, but through overextension. Factories ran beyond capacity. Workers were pushed past physical limits. Maintenance was deferred. Everything was sacrificed for immediate output. This created a dangerous dependency. The Reich could not slow down without triggering collapse. Demobilization would have released millions of soldiers into an economy incapable of absorbing them. Ending forced labor would have shattered industrial output. Reducing military spending would have exposed massive debt and shortages. Peace was not an option. A victorious Germany would have faced the same dilemma on an even greater scale. Administering a continent-wide empire required enormous resources: troops, administrators, infrastructure, and constant security operations. Every occupied region was both an asset and a liability. The East, in particular, was economically unstable by design. Nazi planners assumed that Eastern Europe would function as a raw material hinterland. Ukraine would provide grain. The Caucasus would provide oil. Russia would provide labor. German settlers would oversee production, protected by SS garrisons. But this vision ignored reality. Mass deportations and famine destroyed local economies. Infrastructure deteriorated. Skilled workers were eliminated or displaced. Transportation networks were overwhelmed by military demands. Agricultural output declined rather than increased. Even under conditions of total victory, these regions would not have transformed into efficient colonies. They would have remained zones of extraction requiring constant repression. Extraction without reinvestment leads to depletion. By the mid-1940s, a victorious Reich would have inherited vast territories incapable of sustaining themselves, let alone supporting German prosperity. The solution, once again, would not have been reform, but further expansion. This expansion was already anticipated. Internal planning documents assumed that Germany would eventually clash with the remaining industrial powers outside Europe. The United States loomed largest. Nazi economic theorists openly discussed the inevitability of conflict with American capitalism, which they viewed as both racially and ideologically hostile. A German-dominated Europe was not meant to coexist with the global order. It was meant to replace it. This is why Allied analysts during the war consistently concluded that Nazi victory would lead to another world war, not prevent one. A continental empire built on autarky and racial hierarchy could not integrate into international trade systems. It would seek domination or collapse. The military implications were obvious. Permanent mobilization would have become a feature of daily life. Military spending would remain prioritized over civilian welfare. Technological development would focus on weapons rather than infrastructure or healthcare. Society would exist in a constant state of preparation for the next conflict. Even German civilians would bear the cost. Rationing would continue. Surveillance would intensify. Labor discipline would harden. Social mobility would be replaced by racial classification and political loyalty. Any sign of dissent would be treated as sabotage. Victory would not have brought relief. It would have normalized emergency. Perhaps the clearest indicator of this was the regime's attitude toward the future. Nazi economic planning rarely extended beyond a few years. There was no serious post-war reconstruction model, no vision of a stable consumer society, no roadmap for demilitarization. This absence was not accidental. The system did not believe in endings, only in struggle. In speeches to industrialists and party elites, Nazi leaders repeatedly emphasized that peace was dangerous, that it bred complacency and moral decay. War, by contrast, was portrayed as purifying, unifying, and necessary. An economy built on this worldview could not survive tranquility. And yet the greatest contradiction of all remained unresolved. The more territory the Reich controlled, the more resources it required to maintain control. Each new conquest increased administrative costs, security demands, and resistance. The empire grew heavier, not stronger. This dynamic had already begun to undermine Germany during the war itself. Victory would not have reversed it. It would have accelerated it. In this sense, Nazi victory was not a triumph delayed by defeat. It was a catastrophe delayed by resistance. The system's internal logic guaranteed that it would either expand until it collapsed, or collapse when it stopped expanding. In the next chapter, we will examine how this economic and ideological structure shaped daily life under Nazi rule, and why resistance, rebellion, and instability would have remained permanent features of a victorious Reich. Because an empire built on fear does not stabilize, it corrodes. Life under a victorious Reich, control, resistance, and the illusion of order. When people imagine a world in which Nazi Germany won the Second World War, they often picture a frozen continent, rigid, silent, orderly, trains running on time, flags hanging from government buildings, resistance crushed, society disciplined into submission. This image is misleading. What Nazi rule produced wherever it was imposed was not stability, but permanent tension, not obedience, but fear. And fear, unlike loyalty, must be renewed constantly. A victorious Reich would not have relaxed its grip on society. It would have tightened it. Total victory would have removed external enemies, but it would not have ended the regime's obsession with internal ones. In fact, it would have intensified it. Nazi ideology was not satisfied by conquest alone. It required continual purification of thought, of behavior, of blood. Under such a system, daily life was not meant to normalize. It was meant to mobilize. For ordinary Europeans living under German domination, life would have been governed by classification. Race, ancestry, political reliability, and usefulness to the Reich determined one's rights, or lack thereof. This hierarchy was not theoretical. It was already in force across occupied Europe during the war, and victory would have universalized it. Identification papers would define existence. Movement between cities, regions, and occupations would require permits. Employment would be conditional not only on skill, but on ideological compliance. Education would cease to be a space for inquiry and become a mechanism of indoctrination. Children were central to this vision. In Nazi planning, youth was not simply a demographic category. It was raw material. Schools would train obedience before literacy. Physical conditioning would precede intellectual development. Loyalty to the Führer would replace loyalty to family, church, or community. Even German parents would have limited authority over their own children. The state claimed primacy. This was already evident in the structure of Nazi youth organizations, but under victory conditions, participation would become universal and lifelong. The line between civilian and soldier would blur. Society itself would become militarized. For non-Germans, the system was even harsher. In Eastern Europe, the population was never intended to be integrated. Education beyond basic labor skills would be restricted or abolished. Cultural expression would be suppressed. Local elites eliminated. The goal was not assimilation, but management. People were to be reduced to functions: farm workers, miners, builders, servants. Anything beyond that was considered dangerous. This approach guaranteed resistance. Contrary to Nazi expectations, terror did not pacify conquered societies. It radicalized them. Partisan movements flourished precisely because repression left no alternative. When survival itself became an act of defiance, rebellion was inevitable. A victorious Reich would not have faced less resistance. It would have faced more. Security forces would therefore remain permanently overstretched. Entire regions would exist under military administration. Collective punishment would become routine. Hostage executions, village burnings, mass arrests, all normalized as tools of governance. This was not a temporary wartime emergency. It was the planned structure of rule. Even within Germany, the price of victory would have been severe. The Nazi state never trusted its own population. Surveillance networks penetrated workplaces, neighborhoods, and families. Informants were encouraged. Denunciations rewarded. Privacy was framed as a threat. Victory would have justified expanding these systems indefinitely. Without an external enemy to blame for hardship, the regime would turn inward. Economic shortages, labor discipline, and social tension would be explained through internal sabotage. New enemies would be identified. New purges launched. This was not hypothetical. It was how the regime already functioned. The SS, under the leadership of Heinrich Himmler, envisioned itself as the permanent guardian of this order. Its authority would extend beyond policing into every aspect of life: justice, settlement, reproduction, and ideology. Courts would increasingly be replaced by SS tribunals, legal norms by racial logic, sentencing by community value. Justice would no longer mean guilt or innocence. It would mean usefulness. One of the most revealing aspects of Nazi planning was its attitude toward dissent. Opposition was not seen as something to be debated or addressed. It was seen as a biological flaw, evidence of racial or moral weakness. This made compromise impossible. Any system that defines disagreement as pathology must escalate repression endlessly. Victory would not soften this stance. It would confirm it. The result would be a society locked in permanent mobilization against itself. Economically, daily life would reflect the same instability. Rationing would continue. Consumer goods would remain scarce. Housing shortages would persist, especially as resources were diverted to German settlers and military infrastructure. The promise of prosperity, so central to Nazi propaganda, would remain unfulfilled. This gap between promise and reality would create tension even among privileged populations. Germans who expected reward for loyalty would instead find continued sacrifice. Disillusionment would grow and be met with repression. Fear would replace enthusiasm. At the same time, the scale of the empire would make genuine control impossible. Communication delays, bureaucratic rivalries, and local resistance would fragment authority. Regional commanders would rule through personal power, not law. This fragmentation was already visible during the war. Victory would magnify it. The Nazi state was not a streamlined machine. It was a chaotic web of competing institutions, party, military, SS, ministries, bound together by ideology and personal loyalty to Hitler. Without the unifying pressure of war, these tensions would intensify. Power struggles would proliferate. A victorious Reich would therefore be unstable, not only socially, but politically. Succession questions would loom. Rival factions would maneuver. The absence of institutional checks would turn internal disputes into crises. Total control, paradoxically, would produce total fragility. Perhaps the most important consequence of this system was psychological. Living under constant surveillance, ideological pressure, and threat of punishment reshapes behavior. Trust erodes. Community disintegrates. People withdraw into private survival strategies. Societies ruled by fear do not become unified. They atomize. This, too, fuels resistance. Not always organized, sometimes passive, sometimes invisible. Sabotage, noncompliance, slowdowns, cultural preservation in secret. The Nazi regime underestimated this form of opposition. It believed that terror could erase identity. History suggests the opposite. In occupied Europe, cultural memory became a weapon. Language, religion, tradition, all forbidden or restricted, survived underground. Victory would not have extinguished these forces. It would have driven them deeper. And the deeper resistance goes, the harder it is to eradicate. In this sense, a victorious Reich would rule over a continent that was never truly conquered. Beneath the surface of order would lie constant unrest, economic, social, and moral. The system could endure this only by escalating violence. But escalation has limits. Eventually, repression consumes the resources it depends on. Administrators become executioners. Soldiers become jailers. Economies become prisons. This is not a stable endpoint. It is a spiral. In the final chapter, we will examine the unavoidable outcome of this spiral and why even total victory would not have saved the Nazi system from collapse, fragmentation, or catastrophic war. Because regimes built on permanent emergency do not age. They burn out. Why Nazi victory would have ended in collapse or World War III. A Nazi victory in the Second World War would not have marked the end of history. It would not have frozen the world into a grim but stable order, nor would it have delivered the peace promised by propaganda. On the contrary, such a victory would have removed the last external constraints on a system that was inherently incapable of stopping. The Third Reich was not designed to rule a finished world. It was designed to exist in motion, in struggle, in permanent crisis. Once that crisis disappeared, the system would have been forced to recreate it, or collapse under its own contradictions. The fundamental problem of a victorious Nazi Germany was not moral, but structural. Every pillar of the regime, ideology, economy, governance, and security, depended on conflict. Not episodic conflict, but continuous confrontation. The regime defined itself not by what it had achieved, but by what it was still fighting against. Enemies were not temporary obstacles. They were the fuel that kept the system alive. Remove them, and the machinery ceased. This was evident long before the war ended. Even at the height of German expansion, the Nazi leadership showed no signs of preparing for a post-war equilibrium. There was no serious planning for demobilization, no coherent vision of a civilian economy, no institutional framework for long-term governance of a continent. Victory was spoken of as destiny, but its consequences were never resolved. This was not an oversight. It was a reflection of ideology. Nazi thought rejected the idea of a stable end state. History, as it understood it, was eternal struggle between races, nations, and worldviews. Peace was not a goal. It was a threat. Had Germany won the war, this ideological engine would not have shut down. It would have accelerated. Without the Soviet Union as an immediate existential enemy, Without Britain or the United States as active military opponents, the regime would have turned inward and outward simultaneously. Internally, it would have intensified its search for disloyalty, deviation, and weakness. Externally, it would have sought new fronts to justify mobilization and control. Victory would not have satisfied the regime. It would have radicalized it. This dynamic would have been compounded by the nature of Nazi governance. The Third Reich was not a centralized, rational state in the traditional sense. It was a chaotic system of overlapping authorities, competing agencies, and personal loyalties, deliberately structured to prevent institutional stability. Adolf Hitler ruled not through law or bureaucracy, but through personal arbitration between rival power centers. This system functioned only as long as war suppressed internal conflict and provided a shared focus. Remove the pressure of an external war, and the internal contradictions would have come to the surface. A victorious Reich would have faced immediate and destabilizing questions of succession, authority, and control. Hitler's personal dominance masked the absence of any legal or constitutional mechanism for transition. Rival factions within the SS, the military, the party leadership, and the economic administration were already maneuvering for influence during the later years of the war. In a post-war environment, these tensions would not have resolved themselves peacefully. They would have intensified. Power struggles would have become existential. Purges, coups, and internal violence would have been not anomalies, but structural features of the regime's evolution. At the same time, the sheer scale of the empire Germany sought to rule would have made coherent governance impossible. Administering a continent through terror requires immense resources, constant surveillance, and an ever-expanding security apparatus. During the war, these costs were partially absorbed by emergency mobilization and propaganda. After victory, they would have become permanent burdens. The further German authority extended, the more brittle it would have become. Communication delays, bureaucratic rivalries, and regional autonomy would have eroded central control. What appeared as total domination from Berlin would have fragmented into local fiefdoms ruled by SS commanders, party officials, and military governors, each enforcing ideology according to personal interpretation and interest. This fragmentation would have accelerated resistance rather than suppressing it. Nazi planners assumed that terror could pacify conquered populations indefinitely. Experience suggested the opposite. Everywhere German rule was imposed, repression generated hostility faster than it eliminated it. Victory would not have erased this pattern. It would have entrenched it. A Europe governed through racial hierarchy and collective punishment would have remained in a permanent state of low-level insurgency. Suppressing that insurgency would have consumed manpower, resources, and legitimacy at an unsustainable rate. Economically, the contradictions were even more severe. The Nazi economy was not designed to stabilize. It was designed to mobilize. From the beginning, it relied on deficit spending, forced labor, and the extraction of resources from conquered territories. War postponed collapse by justifying extraordinary measures. Peace would have exposed structural weakness immediately. Demobilization would have flooded the labor market with millions of soldiers. Ending forced labor would have crippled industrial output. Reducing military expenditure would have revealed massive debt and shortages. Victory would not have resolved these problems. It would have magnified them. Occupied Europe, which was supposed to serve as the economic foundation of the Reich, was already exhausted by years of extraction. Infrastructure was damaged, agricultural systems disrupted, skilled labor destroyed or displaced. The logic of exploitation left no room for recovery. Regions stripped of resources and population cannot regenerate under continued repression. To maintain output, the Reich would have had to extract more, accelerating depletion and resistance in a vicious cycle. More extraction produced more unrest. More unrest required more repression. More repression increased costs and reduced productivity. No empire can survive such a loop indefinitely. Faced with this reality, the regime would have confronted a choice it could not ideologically accept: reform, loosening repression, integrating subject populations, demilitarizing the economy, would have undermined the ideological foundations of Nazi rule. The alternative was further expansion. Conquest was not simply a means of growth. It was the only way the system knew how to function. This logic inevitably pointed beyond Europe. Even if Germany had defeated the Soviet Union and consolidated control over the continent, it would have confronted an adversary it could not intimidate or absorb: the United States. American industrial capacity, economic reach, and geographic isolation made it fundamentally incompatible with a Nazi-dominated world. Peaceful coexistence would have required ideological compromise and economic integration, both impossible under Nazi doctrine. The regime viewed American capitalism and pluralism as existential threats. American leaders, in turn, would not have tolerated a totalitarian empire dominating Europe and its resources. Strategic assessments during the war consistently concluded that a victorious Nazi Germany and the United States were destined for confrontation. The only variable was timing. A Cold War between these two systems would have been inherently unstable. Unlike later ideological rivalries, there was no shared framework for coexistence. Nazi ideology rejected pluralism entirely. Any prolonged standoff would have been punctuated by crises, proxy conflicts, and escalation. Technological development would have made such a confrontation even more dangerous. A victorious Reich would have continued to prioritize weapons research above all else. Ethical constraints would not have applied. Human experimentation, chemical weapons, biological warfare, and advanced missile systems would have expanded. Nuclear weapons, in particular, represented a decisive risk. Victory would have redirected enormous resources toward closing the technological gap with the United States. A Nazi nuclear program operating without public oversight, civilian restraint, or ethical limits would have posed an unprecedented threat to global survival. In such a world, stability would have been an illusion. The absence of immediate war would not have meant safety. It would have meant preparation. Permanent mobilization would have defined daily life. Surveillance would have intensified. Dissent would have been framed as sabotage or foreign conspiracy. Economic hardship would have been justified as sacrifice for future struggle. Society would have existed in a constant state of readiness for the next conflict. Even without direct confrontation with the United States, internal collapse remained likely. Empires built on repression require constant energy to sustain fear. When that energy diminishes, through leadership crises, economic strain, or social exhaustion, fragmentation follows. Regional authorities assert autonomy. Ideological coherence erodes. Resistance exploits cracks in control. The Nazi system accelerated every factor that historically produces imperial decay. Collapse, however, would not have been peaceful. It would have been violent, chaotic, and catastrophic for millions living under its rule. The disintegration of a heavily armed, ideologically absolutist empire would have unleashed civil wars, mass reprisals, and regional conflicts across Europe. The weapons of the 20th century would have ensured that the human cost was unprecedented. The alternative path was outward. To avoid internal implosion, the Reich would have pursued renewed external conflict. Expansion would have been framed as necessity. War would have been presented as defense. Enemies would have been manufactured if they did not already exist. This path leads inevitably to global war, not as a tragic accident, but as a structural outcome. Such a war would not have resembled the Second World War. It would have been fought with more destructive technologies, fewer restraints, and deeper ideological absolutism. Civilian populations would have borne the brunt. Entire regions would have been devastated. The very survival of human civilization would have been placed at risk. The enduring myth of Nazi victory rests on a false assumption that power, once achieved, seeks stability, that dominance produces order. The Third Reich defied this logic. Its power fed on instability. Its ideology thrived on conflict. Its economy required crisis. Its politics demanded enemies. Victory would not have ended this dynamic. It would have removed the last barriers restraining it. This is why serious historians increasingly reject the idea of a stable Nazi-dominated world. The system contained the seeds of its own destruction from the beginning. Defeat shortened the timeline. Victory would have extended the suffering and multiplied the dead. The real question, then, is not what the world would have looked like if the Nazis had won the Second World War. The question is, how long such a world could have lasted before collapsing under its own weight, or how much of humanity it would have taken with it before doing so.